morning in August, they left their homes to go to war. Men, some not much more than boys from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of preoccupations and obligations, to defend their livelihoods, to defend their town, to defend their country. On the Scottish side of the border, they headed to the Merse to join with countless others from border towns and villages. They were with their neighbours and friends, their dads and uncles, their sons and nephews. They'd put aside their disputes and rivalries, their feuds and enmities. The King of Scots himself would lead them in battle against the English. Men in arms were teeming down from the Borough Muir in Edinburgh. Highlanders, Lowlanders, Borderers, a few from overseas. It was to be the biggest army Scotland had ever put in the field. The English had invaded France, and now Scotland would honour her obligations under the Old Alliance. The men of the borderlands would follow their king and do their duty. Few would return. I've heard them lilting as our yow milking, lasses a looking before the dawn of day. But now they are moaning on ilka green lawn. The flowers of the forest are all weed away. Lord Lieutenant, my Lord, Mr. Chairman, Coldstreamer, followers from both sides of the border, fellow guests, ladies and gentlemen, nearly 500 years on from that fateful day, we gather on this beautiful hillside, and we pause briefly in the midst of the hurley of the last of our great common ridings to take in the magnitude of what happened that day. As we hail the riders, led here so expertly by the Coldstreamer, you give me a great privilege in asking me to make these remarks as we commemorate the Battle of Flodden. I thank you for the honour, for the chance to tackle the significance of the events on this spot all those years ago, for the opportunity to try to make sense of what Flodden means to us all to this day. Some will struggle to understand why so much attention is still paid to a military defeat of such magnitude. Some will wonder at the relevance of the events half a millennium after the catastrophe. Some will miss the point of the commemorations entirely, but not here today. We hear the echoes of the events in our border songs, our verses and our histories. We see the memories, the memorials and the symbols all around us. And we pause each year, across in Selkirk and Hawick, and at so many points across the miles to Flodden Edge and here at Branxton Hill to reflect. Why? Why did it happen? The simplest of questions. And centuries afterwards, they're still asked. Why were Scotland and England at war? Why did Scotland lose from such a strong starting point? Why did so few arrive home? These are just some of the pleas that echo down the years. Many, far better qualified than I, have offered their thoughts and their theories. The chroniclers of the times, the poets, the historians. But the questions still nag. It wasn't as if Scotland's leader was weak or inexperienced. James IV, the King of Scots, was in his prime and had put his mark on Scotland and the wider world, reforming its governance, enhancing its culture, shepherding its resources. He knew his politics and polity, creating government arrangements which outlasted him. He left a cultural mark too, on Linlithgow Palace and Stirling Castle, amongst many other places. He promoted agriculture, trade and the wealth of the nation. Domestically, he was in command. But away from home, he was a player too, recognised at the top table in Europe, respected in Rome by the Church, married to the sister of his powerful southern neighbour Henry VIII. So he knew statecraft. And yet, here he was in the summer of 1513, caught in a vice. unable to persuade his brother-in-law to hold back from his attacks on France, unable to persuade France to release him from his obligations. The strategy was bust. Mixing with the major powers to maintain peace and to promote prosperity had failed. Peace was over, and before long, prosperity. But for those riding or marching to the marshalling points over there north of the Tweed, these are other people's concerns or worries for another day. Indeed, to them, the odds must still have seemed good. The main English armies were in France. The forces left behind were far away, and led, it was said, by an old man from a lacklustre family. The flat lands from here up to the Lammermuirs were home territory for the men of Berwickshire. The Eildons on the horizon were a comforting sight for the men of Gala and Melrose. The moorfoots beyond, similarly so for those from Peebleshire. Over in the west, Ruberslaw would have glinted encouragingly for the men of Hawick. The Cheviot behind us were well kent to the men of Jed and Kelso. In truth, all these men of the borderlands would be fighting as close to home ground as they could ask. The families on the muster knew both sides of the border, for good reasons and bad. Nobody knew it better. And after a couple of weeks of success, taking Norham and Ford, they commanded the heights as the English drew near. So, why did they lose it? Why did they leave their position? To any military person you ask, that is the key to the defeat. There are other issues, of course, like the weather, the weapons, the communications, the nous of some of the generals, their motivation even. But in the chaos and mayhem, suitors from Selkirk, like thousands of their fellow borderers and countless others, had no time to think on this. Lives were snuffed out, swiftly for some, in a lingering, hellish way for the rest, outlived by precious few, and by those unanswered questions. Back across the border, we don't just remember Flodden because of the strategic failure and the tactical disaster it represented. As with our English friends here today, we remember the human dimension too. Humanity and inhumanity side by side. Of course, academics pore over the consequences for the history of Scotland. The troubles of the 16th century, the linking of the crowns and the necks in the Union, even later still. But that is for another day. For while the chroniclers mulled over the questions, people on both sides of this border got on with counting the cost. In modern Britain, few of us know what it is like to go to war. We may, through testimonies, writings and pictures, we may just be able to conjure up what it's like to be in battle. But we need all the powers of our imagination to take in the full scale of the horror of Flodden. Pulling way for the order, send our lads to the border. The English, for instance, beguile on the day. The flues of the forest that fought aye the foremost, the prime of our land, are called in the clay. 500 years ago, in the mud at the foot of this hill, it was not just the King of Scotland who was dead. Thousands of others, of all ranks and none, from both sides, lay with him. Countless wounded in the battle were finished off afterwards. Across Scotland, the news was carried of the carnage and of the slaughter. One man returned to Caithness. He carried a royal decree about the land in the far north, scrawled in a drumskin by James ahead of the battle. The young soldier was dispatched before hostilities began. Nobody else got home. In Linlithgow, the Queen waited for a husband who never returned. Her despair echoed across these borderlands as the enormity of the defeat became plain. From the nuns across a Coldstream to the widows and orphans either side of this border, despair and fear were everywhere. While Edinburgh built its vast walls, borders towns, the menfolk lost, stood weak and fragile. These debatable lands that had always been vulnerable to attack became more so. Boys were forced to become men overnight. Young men acquired their fighting skills and learned their way in the world without elders or mentors. Our ballads and our verses tell the stories of those years, passed on through the generations so we never forget. Every town has its tale, its memories, its pride. Later this afternoon, your chairman will, in a simple ceremony, invite his counterparts from the other towns and communities of the borders to lay a thistle at the monument down there on Piper's Hill. For the past few years, I've participated, honoured as Secretary of State for Scotland, to lay a thistle too for the people of Scotland. In a few minutes, the whole ceremony takes the names of Borders families and lets them ring proudly over this ill-fated hill. Nobody at that point, or indeed anybody here right now, needs to think why we still, 500 years on, commemorate or reflect on Flodden. Well, here nae mair lilting at our young milking. Women in bairns are heartless and way, sighing and moaning on ilka green loaning. The floors of the forest are all weed away. Ladies and gentlemen, let us never forget.